Hi. I'm going to explain the significance events of the Titanic. I'm going to need the iceberg and the cruise ship. Pretend that the cruise ship is the Titanic.
First, the Titanic saw an iceberg. The Titanic tries to avoid it, but it was too slow to turn it.
The iceberg scraped the Titanic's bottom at 11:40 p.m. Then the lifeboat launched by different time. The following lifeboats were launched before the Titanic sinks completely: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Then the Titanic's power goes out, causing to split by half, plunging the Titanic straight up. As the Titanic starts to sink, hundreds of people are in the freezing water. Although there is room in most of the lifeboats, crewmen are fearful that the boats will be swamped. People in the water slowly freeze to death. The stern disappears into the ocean, and the Titanic is gone. The journey of sinking would be 3.9 kilometers, 2.4 miles, deep, located in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The front section and the stern hits the bottom of the ocean.
The Titanic sunk 107 years ago.
Yes.
What? No. The Titanic. It sunk. Here's a brief timeline about the Titanic sinking. On April 14, 1912 at 11:30 p.m., the iceberg lies just 4 miles and 10 minutes ahead. On April 14, 1912 at 11:39 p.m., the iceberg lies just 1,000 yards ahead, but the moonless conditions mean the lookouts cannot see it still. Lookout Frederick Fleet spots a black object in their path. He rings the warning bell 3 times. Moody takes the telephone and receives the famous words, "Iceberg, right ahead." On April 14, 1912 at 11:39 and 30 seconds p.m., Titanic's engines stop. On April 14, 1912 at 11:40 p.m., Titanic collides with the iceberg, scraping its side under the waterline for 75 meters. 4th Officer Box Hall is abreast captain's quarters walking to a bridge. Quartermaster Elliver steps onto bridge and sees Murdoch at the switch for the watertight doors. He also sees the peak of the iceberg past the bridge and hears Murdoch call hard a port. Boxhill steps onto bridge in time to see Murdoch still about the switch. Leading fireman Barrett sees water pouring in 2 feet above the stokehold plates in boiler room 6, number 10, and jumps through the watertight door into boiler room 5 with second engineer Hesketh just seconds before it closes. He then notices water coming into the empty starboard side forward bunker of boiler room 5. Coal falls all around trimmer George Cavell in the aft bunker of boiler room 4, and immediately he starts to dig himself out. On April 14, 1912 at 11:40 and 15 seconds p.m., watertight doors are closed. On April 14, 1912 at 11:41 p.m., Smith comes through the wheelhouse onto the bridge and asks Murdoch what have we struck. Murdoch replies, "An iceberg." Sir Smith tells him to close the watertight doors. Murdoch says, "They are already closed, Sir Boxhill." Murdoch and Smith step out wide onto the starboard bridge wing to look for the berg as the ship's head is now swinging to starboard with the tiller hard over to port. On April 14, 1912 at 11:42 p.m., Boxhill drops down to inspect forward passenger spaces. Litter, still in his quarter, notices that the ship's engines have stopped and decides to get out of his cabin to investigate. Passenger Lawrence Beasley notices engines have stopped and decides to go up the second-class staircase to the boat deck to investigate. Greaser Thomas Ranger notices changeover valves in turbine room had come up indicating the turbine engine had stopped. Seaman Scared sees the iceberg off the starboard quarter as ship's stern is pulling away as the ship is seen turning to starboard. Trimmer Dillon down in the engine room notices that the ship's engines had stopped and then soon started to reverse. Hemming hears a hissing sound as air escapes from forward. On the Californian, 3rd Officer Groves drops down to talk to Captain Lord about an approaching passenger steamer coming up on us from aback their starboard beam. On April 14, 1912 at 11:43 p.m., after seeing Smith put the engine telegraphs to stop and then what appeared to be half speed ahead, Quartermaster Elliver was told to go down and indeed the carpenter and tell him to go and take the draft of the water. Dillon sees the ship's engines start to go ahead slowly. Passenger Henry Svendel notices that the ship's engines appear to be moving again, but was not sure why. On April 14, 1912 at 11:45 p.m., Fireman Shires, having seen the iceberg off the starboard quarter disappearing into the night, now notices the ship was still moving but not by much. Sees ice on the well deck. Littleter sees Murdoch looking out on port bridge wing, and also notices that the ship was moving only 4 to 6 knots through the water. He then decides to cross to the other side where he sees Smith looking out on the starboard bridge wing. Hemming discovers Peep Tank ooding fast from their hissing out of vent pipe, but soon, NDS out that the forepick above tank was dry. Both Swains mid-Haines, just as I got there the chief of care, Mr. Wild, had gotten there, and the lamb trimmer was there, Mr. Hemming. We said the forepick tank was Lynn. The air was coming out and the water was coming in. Many of the crew see ice on the forward well deck after coming up from below, including leading fireman Hendrickson, who, like Shires, said he got a glimpse of the iceberg. Littler meets Pittman while returning to his cabin. On April 14, 1912 at 11:46 p.m. engines put on stop for the last time after ship moved further away from the iceberg which had disappeared off the starboard quarter. Ismay? NDS Smith on bridge asks him what happened and is told that the ship struck ice and may be damaged seriously. On April 14, 1912 at 11:47 p.m. Virginian standing by his Cape Race working continuously with Titanic. Last signal exchanged between Carpathia and Titanic prior to distress message going out. Phillips did not know what happened to Titanic at this point in time other than some mishap took place. Wright was to later tell Senator Smith that Phillips thought she had got damaged in some way and that he expected that we should have to go back to Harlan and Wolf's. Hendrickson decides the collision was nothing serious and goes back down to his quarters to turn in again. Second Engineer Hesketh tells everyone to return to their stations, and Barrett and Shepard climb up the escape to go back to Boiler Room 6. On April 14, 1912 at 11:49 p.m., over 1 million gallons of water entered the ship. On April 14, 1912, 11:50 p.m. 14 feet of water poured into the front part of the ship. On April 14, 1912 at 11:56 p.m., all Titanic's engines are ordered to stop. On April 15, 1912 at 12 a.m., the lifeboats begin to be ready for launch. The 20 boats have space for only 1,178 of the more than 2,200 people on board. An order is later given for women and children to board first, with crewmen to row and guide the boats. On April 15, 1912 at 12:05 a.m., the order is given to uncover the lifeboats and to get passengers and crew ready on deck. On April 15, 1912 at 12:06 a.m., the first-class longware was opened at the Titanic. There is only room in the lifeboats for half of the estimated 2,200 on board. On April 15, 1912 at 12:15 a.m., Captain Smith orders Phillips and Harold Bride to send out a distress signal. Although SOS became the official distress signal several years earlier, many still use CQD. CQ signifies a general call, and the D means distress. The Frankfurt is among the first to respond, but the liner is some 170 nautical miles, 315 kilometers, away, to the south. Other ships also offer assistance, including the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, but are too far away. On April 15, 1912 at 12:17 a.m., Carpathia receives distress message. CQD responses also will come from the Ipiranga, Frankfurt, Baltic, Coronia, Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, SS Mount Temple and Titanic's sister ship, RMS Olympic. On April 15, 1912 at 12:20 a.m., the Carpathia receives a distress signal from the Titanic. Come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQD. Old Manicure liner immediately changes course to aid the stricken ship some 58 nautical miles, 107 kilometers, away. It will take the Carpathia more than 3 hours to arrive. Fourth Officer Joseph G. Boxall, tasked with determining the Titanic's position, revises the coordinates. The location is now given as 41 degrees 46 and 50 degrees 14 W in the distress signals. Passengers waiting to enter lifeboats are entertained by the Titanic's musicians, who initially play in the first-class lounge before eventually moving to the ship's deck. Sources will differ on how long they perform until shortly before the ship sinks, according to some. Speculation will also surround the last song they perform, likely either Autumn or Near My God to Thee. None of the musicians will survive the sinking. On April 15, 1912 at 12:25 a.m., the lifeboats begin loading women and children first. The Carpathia, southeast of the Titanic by about 58 miles, picks up the distress call. On April 15, 1912 at 12:26 a.m., Ipiranga sent a message to Titanic that said, require immediate assistance. On April 15, 1912 at 12:27 a.m., Titanic accepted Ipiranga's message and the Titanic require an immediate assistance. 12:30 a.m. The water reaches into the crew's cabins, on E-deck in front. The flooding of E-deck is a massive problem, since the water cannot pass Scotland Road with no bulkhead or even a door to hold it back. On April 15, 1912 at 12:32 a.m., most lifeboats are preparing for loading. On April 15, 1912 at 12:34 a.m., Titanic sent a message to Frankfurt that said, "We have struck an iceberg and sinking." On April 15, 1912 at 12:35 a.m., Fourth Officer Box Hall recalculates the Titanic's position. On April 15, 1912 at 12:40 a.m., the first lifeboat, number 7, is lowered under supervision of Murdoch, Pittman and Dismay. There are 28 people on board, capacity 65. On April 15, 1912 at 12:42 a.m., the SS Frankfurt responds to the calls. On April 15, 1912 at 12:43 a.m., Lifeboat 4 is lowered. On April 15, 1912 at 12:44 a.m., Lifeboat 5 is lowered. Low loses his temper with Ismay. On April 15, 1912 at 12:44 and 30 seconds a.m., the D-deck gangway door is opened, but they won't even use it. On April 15, 1912 at 12:45 a.m., number 7 on the starboard side is the first lifeboat lowered. It carries some 27 people even though it has room for 65. Many of the first lifeboats will be launched well below capacity, partially because of the crewmen's worry that the davits would be unable to hold a fully loaded lifeboat. In addition, many passengers are initially afraid to leave the ship, believing that the Titanic is unsinkable. On April 15, 1912 at 12:45 and 30 seconds a.m., after watertight doors are opened, the Titanic fires the first of 8 distress rockets. A ship has been sighted less than 10 nautical miles, 18.5 kilometers, away, but the crew is unable to contact it through telegraph or Morse lamp. The rockets also prove unsuccessful. Crewmen aboard the Californian see the rockets but fail to determine their source. Thought for some time to be the nearby ship seen by the Titanic, the Californian will later be believed to have been some 20 nautical miles, 37 kilometers, away. The mystery ship will be thought to be a Norwegian fishing vessel that was illegally hunting seal. On April 15, 1912 at 12:46 a.m., Lifeboat 5 encounters lowering difficulties. On April 15, 1912 at 12:47 a.m., Officer Boxhill launches the first distress rocket as a signal. On April 15, 1912 at 12:47 and 30 seconds a.m., a crew of stokers rushed to the grand staircase. On April 15, 1912 at 12:48 a.m., 2 quarterbacks telephone the bridge to notify them of rockets and lifeboats in the water. On April 15, 1912 at 12:49 a.m., the Carpathia was 58 miles away. On April 15, 1912 at 12:50 a.m., Caronia sent a message to Baltic that said, "Titanic wants immediate assistance." And steam stops venting. Lifeboat 9 is lowered. On April 15, 1912 at 12:51 a.m., Second Officer Littler adopts the women and children only policy. On April 15, 1912 at 12:52 a.m., the starboard list is eliminated as boiler room 5 floods. On April 15, 1912 at 12:53 a.m., Mount Temple sent a message to all ships that said, "Titanic calling SOS." On April 15, 1912 at 12:55 a.m., number 3 is lowered. It carries approximately 39 people, 12 of whom are part of the ship's crew. On April 15, 1912 at 12:58 a.m., the orchestra moves to the grand staircase. On April 15, 1912 at 1 a.m., Second Officer Littler lowers lifeboat number 8, 28 people aboard. The watertight bulkhead between boiler rooms 5 and 6 is tested by the pressure on the other side, the damage by the cold fire, and gives away. E-deck starts to flood, and Scotland Road makes the Titanic stop lurching to starboard, and immediately after, she is much more heavily lurching to port. The news that Titanic is sinking reaches Cape Race in the U.S. Half the world is now listening to Titanic. The grand staircase landing on E-deck starts flooding. Water is seen at the base, E-deck, of the grand staircase. On April 15, 1912 at 1:02 a.m., a message sent said, CQD CQD SOS SOS. On April 15, 1912 at 1:03 a.m., Virginia received both messages after the Titanic wants immediate assistance. On April 15, 1912 at 1:05 a.m., number 1 is launched with only 12 people. It can hold 40. An emergency cutter, it is smaller than a standard lifeboat and was designed for quick lowering, as in cases of a person overboard. Among its occupants are first-class passenger Sir Cosmo Edmund Duff Gordon and his wife, Lucy. 7 of the occupants are crewmen, and Duff Gordon pays each of them £5, reportedly to replace lost clothing and gear, but possibly according to subsequent accusations as a bribe to keep the crew from letting anyone else into the boat. On April 15, 1912 at 1:07 a.m., suction pumps are assembled and activated in the flooded areas. On April 15, 1912 at 1:10 a.m., number 8 is among the first lifeboats lowered on the port side. It is launched with only 28 people, including first-class passenger Lucy Noel Martha, Countess of Rebs, who will later man the tiller. Isidore and Ida Strauss are offered seats in the boat. However, Isidore refuses to disobey the order of women and children first. Ida, in turn, will not leave her husband's side, reportedly saying, "Where you go, I go, neither will survive." Number 6 is also launched with 23 people. On April 15, 1912 at 1:14 a.m., Lifeboat 6 stops lowering after being realized that there's not enough people. On April 15, 1912 at 1:15 a.m., Titanic lurches 1 or 2 degrees to port, the deck tilting. On April 15, 1912 at 1:18 a.m., the Titanic starts listing to port. On April 15, 1912 at 1:20 a.m., number 10 is launched. Among the occupants is 9-week-old Millie Nadine, who was the last living survivor of the disaster. However, she died in 2009 at the age of 97. One of the occupants is American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim's alleged mistress. Guggenheim and his valet later change into formal attire, and he reportedly says, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen. His body will never be recovered." On April 15, 1912 at 1:22 a.m., Boiler Room 4 is forced to be abandoned. On April 15, 1912 at 1:23 a.m., the Titanic is increasingly lists to port. On April 15, 1912 at 1:25 a.m., possibly not understanding the dirence of the situation, the Olympic radios, "Are you steering southerly to meet us?" The Titanic responds, "We are putting the women off of the boats while still hours away. The Olympic will be informed by the Carpathia of the Titanic's sinking." Number 12 is lowered with about half of its seats empty. However, it will eventually carry more than 70 people. On April 15, 1912 at 1:26 a.m., 5th Officer Lowe fires a pistol to scare off a mob of men. On April 15, 1912 at 1:26:30 a.m., RMS Baltic is coming to the Titanic. On April 15, 1912 at 1:27 a.m., Titanic sent a message to Olympic that said, "We are putting the women off of the boats." On April 15, 1912 at 1:28 a.m., SS Frankfurt is also coming to the Titanic. On April 15, 1912 at 1:29 a.m., revolvers are issued to Titanic's officers. On April 15, 1912 at 1:30 a.m., amid the growing panic, several male passengers tried to board number 14, causing 5th Officer Harold Lowe to fire his gun 3 times. He is later placed in command of the boat. After the sinking of the Titanic, Lowe will transfer people into lifeboats 4, 10, 12, and collapsible D so he can return to look for survivors in the water. He will pull several men to safety and rescue those in the partially flooded collapsible lifeboat A. The collapsible lifeboats have canvas sides that can be folded for easy storage. Their capacity is 47. Phillips continues to send out distress calls with growing desperation. Women and children in boats cannot last much longer. On April 15, 1912 at 1:31 a.m., 2nd Officer Littler orders men out of Lifeboat 2. Number 13 is launched and is soon followed by number 15, which holds many third-class passengers. As it is being lowered, number 15 nearly lands on number 13, which has drifted under it. However, the crewmen in number 13 are able to cut the launch ropes and row to safety. Number 9 on the stern starboard side is lowered. With some 40 out of 56 people on board, it is nearly full. On April 15, 1912 at 1:32 a.m., RMS Virginian is coming to the Titanic. On April 15, 1912 at 1:33 a.m., Titanic communicates to 12 ships. On April 15, 1912 at 1:34 a.m., sailors link arms to hold back riotous passengers. On April 15, 1912 at 1:35 a.m., number 16 is launched. On April 15, 1912 at 1:37 a.m., Baltic is rushing to the Titanic to come rescue people, and Cape Race, Canada, is out of range. On April 15, 1912 at 1:40 a.m., Collapsible C is lowered. Among its occupants is White Star Chairman J. Bruce Ismay. Although he will later claim that no women or children were in the area when he boarded the lifeboat, others will refute that assertion. His decision not to go down with the ship will result in many branding him a coward. On April 15, 1912 at 1:41 a.m., lifeboat number 15 lowered, this time with 65 people aboard. Under the rush to escape, boat number 13 almost crushed when it is washed under the descending boat number 15. On April 15, 1912 at 1:42 a.m., lifeboat 13 is launched with 55 people. On April 15, 1912 at 1:43 a.m., the orchestra briefly disbands to retrieve lifeboats. On April 15, 1912 at 1:44 a.m., lifeboat 13 is pushed aft by the force of the bilge. On April 15, 1912 at 1:44 and 30 seconds a.m., lifeboat number 15 lowered, this time with 68 people aboard. On April 15, 1912 at 1:45 a.m., number 11 is lowered with some 50 people aboard. On April 15, 1912 at 1:45 and 20 seconds a.m., lifeboat 13 cannot release itself. On April 15, 1912 at 1:45 and 30 seconds a.m., lifeboat 13 is released and pulls out from the water. On April 15, 1912 at 1:46 a.m., number 2, an emergency cutter, is launched under the command of 4th Officer Boxall. Aboard are 17 people. On April 15, 1912 at 1:47 a.m., Frankfurt sent a message to the Titanic that said, "Are there any boats around you?" On April 15, 1912 at 1:48 a.m., lights on the horizon disappears. On April 15, 1912 at 1:49 a.m., RMS Olympic is around 500 miles away. 1:50 a.m. Lifeboats 10 and 4 with 35 and 30 people aboard respectively, leave the ship. The power on the Titanic decreases more. On April 15, 1912 at 1:51 a.m., lifeboat 10 is launched with 55 people. On April 15, 1912 at 1:52 a.m., Titanic's power decreases even more. On April 15, 1912 at 1:54 a.m., lifeboat 4 rows to the gangway door, but they can't find it. On April 15, 1912 at 1:55 a.m., the Titanic's signal is declining and the power decreases a lot more. On April 15, 1912 at 1:56 a.m., Captain Smith gave the 2 operators the permission to abandon their post and save themselves. On April 15, 1912 at 1:57 a.m., Littleton fires his gun into the air to keep passengers from swarming collapsible D. On April 15, 1912 at 1:59 a.m., Captain Smith, Thomas Andrews, and Officer Wild makes a desperate attempt of using the megaphone to call back the half-full lifeboats to the ship to pick up more passengers. Busisne is ordering to collapsible boat C. On April 15, 1912 at 2 a.m., the only lifeboats that remain on the Titanic were 3 of the collapsible boats. The Titanic's bow has sunk low enough that the stern's propellers are now clearly visible above the water. Crewmen lower collapsible lifeboat D from the roof of the officers' quarters. More than 20 people are in the boat. On April 15, 1912 at 2:02 a.m., the crew began working on the final 2 collapsible boats. On April 15, 1912 at 2:03 a.m., as the Titanic's bow goes under, Titanic's power decreased even more. The collapsible A is washed from the deck. Some 20 people manage to get into the boat, which is partly filled with water. By the time line number 14 comes to their aid, only 12 are alive. 3 bodies are left in the boat, which will be discovered a month later by the Oceanic. As crewmen try to release collapsible B, it falls, and, before it can be righted, it is swept off the Titanic. Some 30 men find safety on the still overturned lifeboat, including wireless operator Bright and second officer Littler. The men will later be taken aboard numbers 4 and 12. Captain Smith releases the crew, saying that it's every man for himself. Smith is reportedly last seen on the bridge. His body will never be recovered. On April 15, 1912 at 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat departs, leaving over 1,500 people on the sinking ship. On April 15, 1912 at 2:07 a.m., Smith, Andrews, and Wild abandon their hopes to call lifeboats back to the Titanic. On April 15, 1912 at 2:08 a.m., last messages are heard from the Titanic. On April 15, 1912 at 2:09 a.m., collapsible A slid off the roof. On April 15, 1912 at 2:09 and 05 seconds a.m., wireless room is abandoned. On April 15, 1912 at 2:10 a.m., Steward Edward Brown saw the captain approach with a megaphone in his hand. He heard him say, "Well boys, do your best for the women and children, and look out for yourselves." He saw the captain walk onto the bridge alone. This was the last reliable sighting of Smith. Cecil Fitzpatrick reported seeing Captain Smith on the bridge, talking to Andrews. He also saw Andrews leave the ship at the last minute. On April 15, 1912 at 2:10 and 10 seconds a.m., gunshots are heard from Murdoch's position. On April 15, 1912 at 2:11 a.m., crewmen struggle to free collapsible B and A on the roof of the officers' quarters. They eventually float off the ship, overturned, and later saves more than a dozen men from the freezing water who balance and cling to its curved hull in the icebound Atlantic. Captain Smith is last seen in the bridge, the water up to his waist, his hands on the wheel. Philadelphia banker Robert W. Daniel describes it. "I saw Captain Smith in the bridge. My eyes seemingly clung to him. The deck from which I had leaped was immersed. The water had risen slowly, and was now to the floor of the bridge. Then it was to Captain Smith's waist. I saw him no more. He died a hero. Just by then, the water comes settling over the boat deck, the bridge quickly goes under and the boats float away. On April 15, 1912 at 2:12 a.m., survivors distinctly hear 4 explosions from deep within the ship. On April 15, 1912 at 2:13 a.m., Titanic begins its rapid, final plunge into the sea. A giant wave washes across the boat deck, forcing the remaining passengers to the stern. Many people are washed off the deck and fight to get into the collapsibles, but some occupants push them back. Meanwhile, water reaches funnel no. 1, and its cords snap, causing it to fall on some swimmers. On April 15, 1912 at 2:15 a.m., the grand staircase is flooded to the clock and a massive wave crashes through the iron and glass dome. The propellers now come out of the waters with the stern rising rapidly. In 3 minutes it reaches an angle of 23 degrees. On April 15, 1912 at 2:17 a.m., Phillips sends a final distress signal. He reportedly makes it to the overturned collapsible lifeboat B but succumbs to exposure. His body will not be found. On April 15, 1912 at 2:18 a.m., the lights on the Titanic go out, plunging the ship into darkness. As the Titanic's bow continues to sink, the stern rises higher out of the water, placing great strain on the midsection, and the ship breaks in two between the third and fourth funnels. Reports would later speculate that it took some 6 minutes for the bow section, likely traveling at approximately 30 miles, 48 kilometers, per hour, to reach the ocean bottom. The stern momentarily settles back in the water before rising again, eventually becoming vertical. It briefly remains in that position before beginning its final plunge. On April 15, 1912 at 2:19 a.m., the stern rapidly floods with water now. The Titanic's power went down, and the submerging front section pulls him via the keel back in the air, ripping in half, until she almost goes straight up. As the front section is sunk, the stern floods and rises in the air quickly till she reaches 89 degrees. The bow finally gets entirely loose, and goes down to the bottom. On April 15, 1912 at 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's broken-off stern settles back into the water, becoming more level for a few minutes. Slowly fills with water and tilts its end high into the air before sinking into the sea. People in the water slowly freeze to death. The stern disappears into the ocean, and the Titanic is gone. Water pressure allegedly causes the stern, which still has her inside, to implode as it sinks. The stern lands some 2,000 feet, 610 meters, from the bow. Hundreds of people are in the freezing water. Although there is room in most of the lifeboats, crewmen are fearful that the boats will be swamped. Several boats eventually return, but too late. A few people are pulled to safety, but most die of exposure. On April 15, 1912 at 2:21 a.m., the Titanic is breaking apart and implodes. On April 15, 1912 at 2:24 a.m., after a smooth journey of 3.9 kilometers, 2.4 miles, down, the front section hits the bottom of the ocean. On April 15, 1912 at 2:27 a.m., after a bumpy ride of 3.9 kilometers, 2.4 miles, down, the stern section hits the bottom of the ocean. That's the brief history about the Titanic sinking.
Okay. Anyway, happy Memorial Day.